There are shadows in the corners of history, places where the ink of the scribe's pen seems to tremble, where tales are told not in grand halls but in hushed whispers by the dying embers of a fire. These are the stories of monsters who wore crowns, of men whose cruelty was so profound, so inventive, it transcends mere tyranny and enters the realm of nightmarish legend. Today, we venture into one such shadow to speak of a name that has been all but erased, a prince whose depravity gave birth to a horror unique in the annals of human suffering. We speak of Prince Valerius and the silent, breathing collection of his palace. It is said that in the grand throne room of the onyx spire, visitors would remark on the exquisite, if unsettling, nature of the decor. The footstool before the prince's dais, carved with an uncanny realism, its surface warm to the touch. The ornate candelabras held aloft in the banquet hall, their human-like forms, so detailed you could almost see the flicker of a pulse beneath the gilded paint. The low tables in the solarium, bearing the weight of wine goblets and books upon their strangely supple surfaces. But these were not carvings, they were not statues, they were people. This is the story of the sadistic prince who used living human beings as his furniture, a chronicle of a mind's descent into an abyss so deep it threatened to swallow an entire kingdom. How does a man, born to privilege and power, become a creature of such specific, artistic cruelty? The answer, as is so often the case, begins in the cold, gilded cage of his childhood. Valerius was not born of peasants. He was the sole heir to the prosperous kingdom of Eldoria, a land of green valleys and stone castles. His father, King Theron, was a ruler of practicality and war, a man whose hands were more comfortable on the hilt of a sword than on the shoulder of his son. His mother, Queen Isolde, was a woman of porcelain beauty, and even greater fragility, lost in her own world of melancholic poetry and quiet despair. The young prince grew up in a world of profound emotional silence. He was given everything a boy could desire: tutors, ponies, miniature silver swords, but he was denied the one thing a child truly needs: genuine human connection. His world was one of transactions. Obedience was rewarded with gifts. Silence was rewarded with peace. His every need was met by servants who moved with silent, fearful efficiency, their faces masks of deference. They were, in a functional sense, objects. They brought him food, they cleaned his chambers, they dressed him. They were tools, not people. And in this sterile environment, a dangerous seed was planted in the fertile soil of his young mind, a fascination with control and a deep-seated contempt for the perceived weakness of others. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed as boyhood mischief. He would trap insects in glass jars, not to study them, but to watch them exhaust themselves against the invisible walls. He would meticulously pull the wings from flies, his focus absolute, his expression not of anger, but of intense curiosity. His tutors reported a brilliant but unnerving intellect. He could debate philosophy with men 3 times his age, his logic impeccable. Yet he showed a chilling lack of empathy. When reading tales of heroes and villains, he was not interested in the hero's triumph, but in the villain's methods. Why did the dragon burn the village? Not because it was evil, he would argue, but because it could. It was an expression of its nature, its power. His cruelty soon graduated from insects to animals. A stable boy found a litter of puppies, their legs broken and meticulously reset at impossible angles, left to whimper in a neat, horrific row. A falcon prized by his father was discovered blinded, its eyes pierced with a lady's hairpin. When confronted, Valerius would feign ignorance, or more chillingly, provide a calm, rational explanation that made the accuser feel foolish. He learned to mask the darkness behind a veneer of aristocratic charm, a skill that would serve him well. The courtiers saw a quiet, intense young man. They did not see the cold void behind his eyes. King Theron, a man who understood the battlefield but not the human heart, saw his son's lack of sentimentality as a strength. He believed Valerius would be a strong, unsentimental king, one who would not be swayed by petty emotions. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. The king's health began to fail when Valerius was in his late teens. As Theron grew weaker, Valerius grew bolder. He began to see the court not as a collection of people, but as a set of pieces on a board, his board. He would orchestrate minor social humiliations, pitting one courtier against another with a whispered word, then watching the fallout with the detached air of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. He found that he could make people do things, debase themselves, with the slightest pressure. A noblewoman desperate for favor was subtly manipulated into wearing a garish gown that made her a laughingstock. A proud captain of the guard was goaded into a drunken boast that saw him demoted. These were his experiments in the malleability of the human will. He was testing his power, honing it, when King Theron finally died. The transition of power was seamless. Prince Valerius became King Valerius, and with the crown firmly upon his head, the restraints, few as they were, disappeared entirely. The kingdom of Eldoria was about to learn the true nature of its new ruler. At first, the changes were deceptively benign. He streamlined the bureaucracy, his sharp mind cutting through years of inefficiency. He hosted lavish parties, his charm and wit dazzling foreign dignitaries. Many breathed a sigh of relief. The intense boy had become a capable man. But for those within the inner circle of the onyx spire, a creeping dread began to take hold. The punishments for minor infractions became disproportionately severe. A servant who spilled a drop of wine on the king's sleeve was not dismissed. He was publicly flogged for an hour, forced to lick the flagstones clean, and then exiled. A lady in waiting who giggled at the wrong moment was stripped of her titles and forced to serve as a scullery maid. These were not acts of justice, they were performances of power. Valerius wanted to demonstrate, in no uncertain terms, that the lives and dignity of everyone in his kingdom were his to control, to shape, to break. His fascination with the physical and psychological breaking point of others became his central obsession. He would summon courtiers to his private chambers for long, rambling philosophical discussions that would last through the night. He would demand they stand perfectly still, without food or water, while he mused on the nature of loyalty. Any wavering, any sign of fatigue, was met with a cold, disappointed glare and a mark against their name. He was conditioning them, breaking their spirits, turning proud nobles into trembling sycophants who lived in constant terror of his displeasure. It was during this period that the whispers began, the first horrifying rumors that would eventually define his reign. A disgraced knight, known for his unyielding pride, vanished from the dungeons. A few weeks later, a new throne appeared in Valerius's private study, a high-backed chair of dark polished wood, with arms that ended in what looked disturbingly like human hands, clenched into fists. Courtiers who saw it shuddered. The craftsmanship was unlike anything they had ever seen, unnervingly lifelike. The true horror, the central pillar of his monstrous legacy, began with a captive from a border skirmish. The man was a chieftain, proud and defiant even in chains. Valerius, instead of executing him, saw a new kind of canvas. He summoned the royal physicians not to heal, but to aid in a grotesque transformation. Using a cocktail of rare herbs and paralytic agents, they rendered the chieftain immobile, his mind aware, but his body an unresponsive prison. His limbs were bent and fixed into the shape of a low table. His skin was treated and polished, his eyes held open by a cruel, delicate mechanism, forced to witness his own degradation. Valerius placed this table in his solarium. He would sit beside it for hours, sipping wine, reading a book, a occasionally running his fingers over the warm surface, feeling the faint, thrumming beat of the life trapped within. He had achieved the ultimate expression of his philosophy. He had taken a human being, a thinking, feeling person with a will of their own, and had reduced them to a mere object, an extension of his own environment, their existence defined solely by his use for them. This was not just murder, it was the complete and utter annihilation of a person's identity. He called it his silent collection, and he wanted more. The collection grew piece by piece, each one a testament to his escalating depravity. He began to select his victims with the discerning eye of a connoisseur. A beautiful dancer, renowned for her grace, was transformed into a lithe, elegant coat-rack, her limbs permanently poised in a tragic parody of her art. A boastful strongman from the city guard became a sturdy footstool, his powerful muscles locked and useless. A pair of twins, young pages who had served him since childhood, were bound together. Their bodies contorted to form an ornate love-seat, their silent screams trapped behind paralyzed lips. The process was a meticulous, horrifying ritual. Victims were chosen, isolated, and psychologically broken long before the physical transformation began. They were starved, sleep, deprived, and subjected to endless monologues from Valerius about their own insignificance. He wanted them to understand on a fundamental level that they were ceasing to be human. They were becoming things the alchemical concoctions used were refined to perfection. They didn't kill, they preserved. They kept the heart beating, the lungs breathing, but severed the connection between mind and muscle. The victims were trapped in a state of living death, fully conscious, able to see and hear everything around them, but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to even blink without the king's intervention. They became silent witnesses to their own unending nightmare. The palace became a museum of horrors to the uninformed visitor. It was a display of eccentric, albeit morbid, art. But to those who knew the truth, the terrified physicians, the complicit guards, the silent servants, it was a living hell. They walked through halls lined with their former friends and colleagues. They saw the flicker of sheer, undiluted terror in the eyes of the candelabra that had once been the court jester. They felt the warmth of the carpet that had once been a group of peasant rebels, their bodies stitched together in a grotesque tapestry of flesh. Life in the onyx spire became a masterclass in denial and fear. No one spoke of it. To acknowledge the truth was to risk becoming the next piece in the collection. Courtiers would compliment the king on his exquisite new chaise lounges, all while avoiding the gaze of the woman who had once been the Duchess of Northwood. They would drink wine poured from a decanter resting on a table that had been their rival. They lived in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance, their survival dependent on their ability to pretend that the monstrous reality before them was normal. But such a reign of terror could not last forever. The darkness within the palace walls began to seep out, carried by escaped servants and horrified foreign envoys. Tales of the living palaces spread through the kingdom and beyond. Stories so grotesque they were often dismissed as outlandish propaganda. Yet, the sheer number of disappearances from the capital could not be ignored. Entire families of minor nobility vanished. Prominent citizens who voiced the slightest dissent were never seen again. Fear was a palpable smog that choked the city. The catalyst for the end came from an unexpected source, Valerius's own hubris. He decided he needed a centerpiece for his throne room, a grand statement of his power. He chose his target, Lady Alara, the daughter of his own captain of the guard, a man named Marcus, who had served the royal family with unwavering loyalty for 40 years. Alara was known for her kindness, her beauty, and her spirit, qualities that Valerius found particularly enticing to corrupt and extinguish. Captain Marcus was a man of simple, rigid honor. He had served King Theron, and he would serve his son, King Valerius. He had turned a blind eye to the king's excesses, convincing himself they were the necessary, if harsh actions of a strong ruler. He had heard the whispers, but he had dismissed them. No man, not even a king, could be such a monster. His denial shattered when he received the king's summons. Valerius, in a display of ultimate contempt, informed Marcus of his intentions directly. He described in lurid detail how he would transform Ilara into a living statue to be placed beside his throne, a beautiful, silent guardian for all eternity. He wanted to see if the captain's famed loyalty to the crown was stronger than his love for his own daughter. It was Valerius's final, fatal miscalculation. He had tested the breaking point of one man too many. In that moment, the lifetime of duty in Marcus's heart was incinerated by a father's protective rage. He bowed, seemingly in acceptance, and left the king's presence. But he did not go to fetch his daughter. He went to the barracks. For years, Marcus had been the bedrock of the military, respected by every soldier. His word was law. That night, he gathered his most trusted officers. He did not need to shout or persuade. He simply told them the truth. He told them what the king had planned for his daughter. He told them of the silent collection. He confirmed the whispers and the rumors, lending them the undeniable weight of his authority. The horror and revulsion were immediate. These were soldiers, men of blood and battle, but the king's cruelty was a different kind of evil, a perversion that sickened them to their core. A plan was forged in the torch, lit darkness of the barracks, a swift, brutal coup. At the same time, another plot was converging. A small group of courtiers, led by a quiet, unassuming court scribe named Julian, had been secretly documenting the king's atrocities for months. Julian, whose own brother had become one of the early decorations, had been risking his life every day, compiling a list of the disappeared and gathering testimonies from terrified servants. He had made contact with disgruntled merchants in the city and leaders of the burgeoning peasant resistance in the countryside. The captain's rebellion was the spark they had been waiting for. As dawn broke, the palace awoke not to the usual silent terror, but to the sounds of steel and shouting. Marcus and his soldiers stormed the onyx spire. They met little resistance. The palace guards, long demoralized and living in fear themselves, threw down their weapons, many of them weeping with relief. The rebels moved with purpose, securing the physicians who held the secrets to the paralytic agents, their knowledge vital if there was any hope for the victims. Valerius was found not in his throne room, but in his private workshop, preparing his instruments for Ilara's transformation. When Marcus burst in, the king showed no fear, only annoyance at the interruption. He looked at his lifelong captain, a man he had considered another one of his objects, and sneered. "You dare?" he asked, his voice calm. "You would trade your kingdom for one girl?" "She is not just a girl," Marcus roared, his voice cracking with grief and fury. "She is my daughter, and these were your people." He gestured around the workshop, at the sketches and plans for future pieces of human furniture. The fight was short. Valerius, for all his intellectual prowess, was not a warrior. He was disarmed and subdued, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. He could not comprehend that his will, which he saw as an absolute force of nature, had been defied. As the king was dragged away in chains, Julian the scribe and his followers threw open the palace gates. The people of the city surged in, their fear finally eclipsed by their rage. They saw with their own eyes the truth of the horrific rumors. They saw the footstool that had been the baker from the corner street. They saw the coat rack that had been the girl who sold flowers in the square. The collective gasp of horror was followed by a roar of fury, a sound that shook the very foundations of the onyx spire. What followed was a frenzy of grief and retribution. Valerius was not given a trial. He was handed over to the mob, his end a brutal and swift counterpoint to the slow, agonizing torment he had inflicted on so many. The physicians, under duress, began the painstaking process of trying to reverse the paralysis of the silent collection. For some, it was too late. Their minds had shattered from the unending horror, or their bodies had atrophied beyond recovery. They were mercy-killed, finally granted the peace of true death. But some were saved. They awoke from their living nightmare, their bodies weak, their minds scarred, but alive their testimonies would form the final damning chapter of King Valerius's story. They spoke of the chilling monologues he would deliver, of watching their own families walk past them. Oblivious, they spoke of the unending silent scream that had been their only companion. The kingdom of Eldoria was saved, but it was forever changed. The onyx spire was torn down, stone by stone, as if to erase the stain of its history. Captain Marcus, a reluctant hero, helped establish a council to rule, refusing the crown for himself. The story of King Valerius became a forbidden tale, a source of national shame. And yet, it is a tale that must be told. It serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when power is unchecked and empathy is absent. Valerius was not a simple brute or a madman in the conventional sense. He was a creature of immense intellect and cold, calculating logic, a philosopher of sadism. His evil was not chaotic. It was meticulous, artistic, and born from a profound contempt for humanity. He didn't just want to kill his victims, he wanted to deconstruct their very being, to prove that a person could be reduced to an object, that will and spirit were illusions he could extinguish at his leisure. The story of the living furniture is a descent into the darkest corner of the human imagination. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that the greatest monsters are not mythical beasts or supernatural demons, but human beings who have chosen to excise their own humanity piece by piece until nothing is left but a cold, predatory void. And it leaves us with a lingering, chilling question. How many other such stories remain, buried in the silent shadows of history, waiting to be told?